You Guardians don't know what it's like to really fight, a man said to the Guardian before him. The Guardian was wearing a red and white plating, the black under armor. His long brown hair was quite curly, sometimes falling down into his eyes, where he would brush it away. He looked at the man with a surprised look on his face, but then laughed, the Guardian's brown curly hair shaking down in front of his eyes again. Don't know what it's really like to fight? He said as he brushed his bangs out of his blue eyes. He looked at the man that made the statement, as well as the other men that had come and sat around him, all of which looking like a ragtag group of mercenaries. Could you explain what you mean by that? He asked them. Y'all don't die, said another one of the men. You have yourselves those little stars that keep you alive, he said. Another man added in. You have powers as well, don't you? That would sure be useful to everyone else if they had them as well, he pointed out. The Guardian looked at the men. Well, I'd assume that since you are all so capable, that you've all faced your fair share of Cabal and Fallen? He asked them, to which they all nodded, looking rather proud of themselves. All right. Well, what about Hive, or Vex, or even the Taken? He asked them, looking at how they would react. All of them looked a little off-put about the question, none of them wanting to admit that they had never even seen any of those races. Well, they aren't on Earth, so we don't see them. One of them tried to reason. The Guardian shook his head. Correction. You haven't seen them. I have met more than my fair share of Hive and Taken on Earth, he said, sitting up, resting his foot on his opposing knee. There is a reason behind that, though, he said, watching the men around him. He couldn't help but smile, enjoying their reactions to him saying that. There are many people that have made areas that normal people are not allowed to go into. Hawthorne, the lady that got humans out of the city to start fighting our enemies, has even asked that people like you, people that don't have the light, don't come into contact with beings of the darkness. So there are some restrictions for where you're allowed to go. His explanation was stopped with one of the men saying, Well, why not? We can find him just as well as you can, he said, though the Guardian had noticed that the man had a pint in his hand. Apparently, the man was feeling confident from outside influences. Because even Guardians can die from them, the Guardian said, his expression turning cold. Or even worse, I have seen what happens to people without light. Guardians drained of the light then either get killed or filled with the darkness. He said, shaking his head, I've had a close call myself, and I never want to have that experience again. The Guardian, who had been looking cheerful and pleasant since the men had gone to talk with him, now looked haunted, his expression cast down into the look of a man that had seen the darkest things the universe had to offer. After a moment of silence, the Guardian looked up at the men around him and smiled. But I gotta do that stuff in order to keep you yahoos safe, he said, standing up. Either way, got super important things to do. Haven't decided what those are yet, but I'll come up with something, he said with a shrug, as he began walking out. Hey, one of the men called out to him. You have a name? He asked. The Guardian turned back to them, a smile on his face. Well, of course I do. You can call me Ace, he said, waving goodbye and closing the door behind him.